Hi guys, welcome back to the Social Tune and a brand new episode of Record Roundup. Well, after the flood of albums last week, this'll be a nice middle ground for me, with some well-known underground acts dropping new albums that I was definitely curious to hear. And we've got ourselves a good mix here of pop, rock, hip-hop, metal, and R&B, ranging from mostly good to truly special. So might as well start with...
Got some money, I'ma blow it all today. They say, Michael, don't throw it all away. And my reply was, there's more on the way. When I said it, I was walking in the rain.
So if you're looking to get into underground hip-hop, then Rhymeslayers Entertainment is definitely a label you should keep an eye on. They put out quality content and feature a ton of incredible talent from the likes of Aesop Rock, Brother Ali, and of course Evidence, aka Michael Peretta, the LA rapper best known for his Weathermen series. A collection of albums where he delivers some insightful commentary inspired by and based around the emotions that he's felt while standing in the rain, something that a lot of us can definitely relate to. And let me be clear, I have loved this guy's music for years, and this series in particular, as both the Weatherman LP and Cats and Dogs are among the best albums of 2007 and 2011 respectively. So how does the trilogy end with the latest installment, Whether or Not? Well, it's a tricky one, that's for sure. If you're going into this album expecting an amazing and deep conclusion, then you're going to be disappointed. Because, as Evidence has made clear in interviews, this is just supposed to be a collection of bangers to send off a trilogy that many people loved and that was very therapeutic for him. Which all ultimately means that while this is still very good and fans will probably love it, it does end up being the least potent of the three for me. Now don't get me wrong, there are still some tricky emotions being tackled here. Especially on the closer where he details how his girlfriend's breast cancer was discovered when she was feeding their son. That cycle of new life saving old life clearly does strike him, and it is a powerful moment. But for the most part, the songs explore his place in hip-hop. The man who had the skills to be huge but decided to stick in his own lane. And with the great beats and punchlines, it certainly is entertaining, but at nearly an hour, it does lack a certain set of dynamics, which means it wears out its welcome after about 10 tracks or so. While there are no bad songs on this album, there aren't really enough standouts either. And it also doesn't help that POS basically tackled this theme with far more detail and intricacy on his last album, Chill Dummy. It's a defiantly solid, banger-filled project that is simply looking to close the book on a chapter of Evidence's life. And with his good friend Alchemist handling a majority of this production, and guests ranging from DJ Premier to Styles P to Rhapsody, I think this album ultimately accomplishes what it set out to do. So for me, it's an extremely strong 7 out of 10. Even though I wanted to love it, this album falls just a little shy of great for me. But hey, it's still damn enjoyable, and I'm definitely looking forward to seeing where Michael will go from here.
Everyone's a winner, baby, that's the truth. That's the truth. Making love to you is such a thrill.
Just a little over a week ago, I reviewed the newest EP by Ron Gallo, Really Nice Guys. Check it out, it's definitely worth a listen. And in that review, I stated that my experience with garage rock in general has been a little bit complicated. At least when it comes to the more modern music released these days. And one of the biggest figures in that is I always mispronounce his name, Segall. The American songwriter and multi-instrumentalist who has steadily been gaining a bigger following in the indie scene over the past few years. A man who has released a total of about 30 projects since 2008, which reflects a passion for music and a dedication to his craft that certainly is admirable. However, it also carries the obvious drawback that a lot of his work isn't all that consistent. And while I wouldn't say he's ever released a bad album, his work over the past couple of years really hasn't impressed me all that much. But even so, I was definitely curious to hear his newest release, Freedom's Goblin, as it was extremely ambitious, a double album that spanned 19 tracks and over an hour of material. So, okay, I wasn't expecting much in terms of a fully fleshed out project, but just like that Migos album, at least some of these songs would stick out to me, right? Well, yes and no. This album actually took me a fair few listens to fully get, which was more than I was expecting, because unlike Culture 2, this one does actually have a fixed theme to it, as the majority of these songs appear to be about failing relationships, or ones with dark, sinister undertones to them. And while it's nowhere close to his most focused or consistent project, it's consistent enough that I would honestly consider this his best album since Sleeper in 2013. And although there are definitely moments that don't work as well as others or some of indulgence, I'd argue that there's no point where this album doesn't kind of kick ass. From the cover of the Hot Chocolate song, Everyone's a Winner, to the ballads like My Lady's on Fire, I'm Free and Rain, to the grim bass line of Despoiler of Cadaver. These are all great and showcase fantastic production and multi-tracking, which, if I'm being honest, is really top-notch across this entire album, with some exceptions like the distortion on Prison, which really didn't fit with the rest of this. Honestly, if I had one big complaint with this album, it would be that it really does run too long. I mean, Big Crit's double album last year was even longer, but the content there was more dynamic and interesting. And unlike that album, there's not much variety to the sound here, and a lot of these songs run very long as it is. So ultimately, I'm a little torn because on the one hand it's really overindulgent, but on the other, it's giving me a lot of a sound that I really do love. Not quite the album that I've been waiting for him to make, but still closer than anything that he's made in a good while. For me, it's a strong 7 out of 10, a mostly consistent project with some real highs. If you're a fan of classic rock, then I would definitely check this out, because trust me, you're bound to find at least something that works for you. So even if you haven't heard this album yet, the name Craig David may ring a bell. That reason being that this guy actually did have some mainstream success in the late 90s and very early 2000s, even in the US, where he notched 2 big hits in 2001 and 2002 respectively. And even on those songs, you could tell that this guy had real talent as an R&B singer. But personally, I've never been a huge fan. Many people have compared this guy to Usher, but while Craig David could almost boast the same range as Usher, he is nowhere near the same level of charm, charisma, or emotional pipes. I don't know, whenever I hear this guy's voice, I'm reminded of Omarion, with a lazy, confident drawl that often just rubs me the wrong way. And unfortunately, on this album, that doesn't really change, as he trades in the smooth R&B that he's known for electronic production, which honestly fits him pretty well because it's incredibly bland. I know that most of the people interested in checking out this album would only do so for the guests, whether they be Goldlink, JP Cooper, or Bastille. But aside from the first one, none of these guys are allowed to be interesting, as they're paired with astoundingly cheap-sounding tropical beats that get old really fast. Now, to be fair, you do get some catchy hooks here and there, like on Heartline or Focus, and again, Live in the Moment featuring Goldlink was genuinely good, but that's unfortunately counterbalanced by the trap-inspired For the Gram, with its ugly beat, ugly vocal filters, and lyric about doing it for the hashtag and Instagram, which ended up being so cringy. It's an awful song. And overall, yeah, I'm not going to remember this. It's a solid 5 out of 10. Craig David isn't awful, and you could certainly do worse than him, but with this release, he clearly proved that he's just kind of a has-been who's desperate to stay relevant, but forgets that he needs to be interesting along the way. Take notes from Philip Phillips, Craig David, and go back to the drawing board.
It's all about you. I think the ones are done with fun. At least it's all about you.
So like many of you, I first heard about Waterparks from John over at ARTV. So when it came time to review their new album, I made sure to go back and give several listens to their debut, Double Dare. And yeah, they're a pretty awesome pop-punk group, and Double Dare may have actually had a shot of making my best albums of 2016. It was a fun, energetic slice of pop-punk that was extremely catchy, and yet also stridently melodic and guitar-driven. And sadly, this album doesn't quite follow in the footsteps of its predecessor. predecessor. Oh, it's mostly catchy, but nowhere near as much, with songwriting that feels even more simplistic than their debut. But worse still is the production, where the mainstream trends once again rear their ugly heads on one of these albums. Sure, we get guitars, but they're processed and blurred into a slurried mix, where we get more and more vocal and instrumental filters flooding songs like Crybaby and Tantrum, or that weirdly atonal beat paired with that annoying whistling on Peach Lobotomy. Now, content-wise, you get your standard breakup and relationship ballads, but there are some interesting standout moments like Blondes or the incredibly catchy 1111, or hey, best of all, Lucky People, which is exactly the kind of schmaltzy love song about growing old together that I love. But that does not take away from the fact that a lot of this album feels irritatingly anonymous. Not bad, and most of it is catchy enough for me not to get too annoyed at them for going full pop, but it's lacking so much bite to it that it ends up kind of irritating me as someone who really did love their debut. So it's an extremely light 6 out of 10, and I'm hoping that the band will pivot back towards rock music with their next release. I know they said that they found it hard to write this album after being on tour, so maybe take a little bit more time when preparing for the next one, and I'm sure that you'll be back on track in no time. And finally, let's talk about the new album by Orphaned Land. So like I said at the beginning of the year, I decided to make it my mission to check out a lot more metal music this year to make up for last year. So I decided to do some research on some upcoming releases that were getting a lot of buzz in the metal community. And that's when I first discovered Orphaned Land, the pioneers of Middle Eastern metal led by frontman Kobe Farry, who have been releasing studio albums since 1994, where they strive to make unifying music in a climate where divide reigns supreme. Because to be clear, these guys are from Israel, where some of these messages about religious unification and tolerance can be controversial, to say the least. And that message of peace and unity has carried them across an incredibly powerful discography, with phenomenal albums like Mabul and The Never-Ending Way of Or Warrior, where they experiment with a fascinating and gorgeous sound that could best be described as progressive oriental death metal. And one thing that I always love about them is their ability to tell well-known legends, fables, and stories through their music. But with all that said, this new project was said to be a little bit different, because the story this album is based off of is the allegory of the cave by Plato, where a group of people are chained up in a cave with a fire behind them, meaning that everything they perceive, their entire existence, is based off of the shadows that they see on the wall in front of them. And when one of the prisoners manages to break free and gets out of the cave, he can't believe that his entire reality is based on a lie, a mere shadow of what is actually real. But when he goes back to tell his friends this and to set them free too, they murder him thinking he's gone insane. It's a powerful story, and one that Plato actually wrote back in the day to demonstrate the willful ignorance of the Greeks, after they murdered his teacher Socrates for his radical ideals. And as you'd expect, this project tells that story track by track. But if you're thinking that this is an album about religious persecution, then you'd be very wrong. Because what this story is meant to be is a reflection of our own lives. After all, we all have our own versions of that cave that we like to live in, and feel comfortable thinking that the shadow of reality that we perceive is the only reality there is. But what about human trafficking, murder, rape, slaughter, famine, and everything else that goes on under our very noses in the world? Sure, we know it's there, but if any of us are actually called out to do something about it, many of us prefer to just dismiss the messengers who are giving us this information. And that's not all that Orphaned Land do with this project, as on songs like In Propaganda, they demonstrate how we're all willfully blinded by our governments, who we all now know are spying on us and manipulating us, as they demonstrate on All-Knowing Eye. And yet, despite everything that's being done to us, despite the fact that we know we're being being controlled, many of us prefer not to resist at all, as we like our lives in our dark little caves. Sure, you may angrily tweet about it, sure, you may work yourself up a bit, but you'll never actually do anything to change things. And on the off chance that you do fight back, well, as the title says, you'll join the other prophets and messiahs of history. From Jesus to Gandhi to Lincoln to MLK, all of whom were assassinated for daring to disrupt the status quo. And to emphasize just how true this still is today, after a closing track that starts with a blaring siren and ends with the sound of a brutal beheading, followed by a chilling silence, we get the epilogue, a tribute song for Victor Jara, the famous Chilean teacher, playwright, songwriter, and activist who was captured, tortured, and murdered by his government for inciting revolution. In other words, unlike Orphaned Land's other albums, this one is angry and hell-bent on pointing out the flaws in our society. Which does bring me to my two minor complaints with this album. Firstly, a real nitpick, but it is a tad underwritten in terms of its content and songwriting. The philosopher in me just feels you could have taken this a few layers deeper. And secondly, the supposed rage the band is feeling doesn't really come through on every single song here. Outside of that gruff spoken word delivery on songs like We Will Not Resist and My Brother's Keeper. But with that said, it is still gorgeously produced with marvelous crescendos, guitars, drums, strings, some impressive bass lines, and a ton of instrumental solos that still sound defiantly Middle Eastern in a lot of the melodies. Heck, there's even a traditional Hebrew hymn thrown in there in the form of Yedidi, calling out to God and asking why he's forsaking us. And besides, you could easily argue that the lack of anger on the majority of this project is in fact a reflection of the audience and the other characters in this story, living in blissful ignorance, especially considering this album gets much more aggressive towards the end. All of which does not change the fact that this album still maintains an epic scope while remaining just over an hour. Take notes, Migos. And combined with the glorious compositions, the engaging storytelling, the epic scope, and the surprise appearances of Hansi Kurt of Blind Guardian on Like Orpheus, and Steve Hackett, formerly of Genesis, on Chains Fall to Gravity, which might just build to one of the greatest climaxes you will hear this year, this album ends up being yet another essential listen for any fan of progressive metal or truly epic music in general. And for me, it's an easy 9 out of 10, bound to be one of the best releases of 2018. This was a huge surprise for me, combining my love for theatrical metal with my love for Greek philosophy. And with every single listen, it grew on me more and more. So again, put some time aside and check out the latest masterpiece in this band's discography. So, thank you guys for watching. Leave a like if you enjoyed. Sorry that went on for so long. I had a lot to say about that last album. Definitely worth it though. And if you're wondering why I didn't give it a full album review, let's just say I'm saving that slot for a certain filthy album that simply supplies me with a lot more material. Either way, if there are any other albums you'd like me to check out, then please post them in the comments or tweet them at me at The Social Tune, link in the description. Otherwise, please subscribe so you don't miss a thing, and until the next time, I'm Finn, and this is The Social Tunes signing off.